Welcome to the Global Discussion, discussions with creatives, leaders, and thinkers. My name is Simon Hodgkins. Today, I'm joined by Karen Eber. Karen, it's a pleasure to have you here on the show. Let's begin by asking you to talk a little bit about yourself and everything that you're involved in. So over to you, Karen.
I am a professional storyteller. I work with companies on how they're building their leaders, teams, and culture, and how they use storytelling to do that. And so I come from a 20 odd year career on the corporate side in companies like General Electric and Deloitte, where I was a head of culture and a chief learning officer, head of leadership development, where I was always trying to persuade people with stories. And now I have my own company that I get the opportunity to help people understand how to be dynamic and memorable communicators leveraging storytelling.
And I suppose, like storytelling, on one sense, it's as old as the hills.
Yeah.
On another sense, it's probably never been more important because we've got not only humans telling stories now, but I've heard a rumor that we've even got AI telling stories now, or trying to at least. Um, Tell us a little bit about from your corporate experience and also into the business that you run now through the Eber Leadership Group. You're the chief storyteller there. I love that title. And of course, the CEO. But tell us a little bit about why it's important that, and I know you do a lot of work with Fortune 500 companies, I should say, but why is this such an important area, more so now than ever?
Even though it's been how we've communicated since our existence, we have new understanding of the brain and how it responds to information and stories. And we also have understanding in what influences decision making, what strengthens trust and relationships. And when you look at all of that research, storytelling is a much more dynamic way to pass along information, to inspire people to action, to influence thinking. We're not hardwired for stories as much as we love to think that, because that implies that if you believe that we're hardwired for stories, that would mean that every story you hear is compelling. And we've just all sat through enough terrible stories to know that isn't true. But there is an existing structure that, with the right steps, with engaging certain things, you can be more memorable and dynamic. You mentioned AI, that will only continue to increase in our daily lives. But there is something that happens when we're listening to a story where oxytocin is released in our brain. Oxytocin is this bonding chemical. It allows for us to feel comfortable around someone. It's a signal to your brain that's like, this person feels safe to be around. But it also leads to this increase in trust. And there's been a bunch of different experiments where they've found, through someone telling a story, more trust was felt toward that person. And as AI grows, we will hear more stories. We already are. They're woven into marketing messages, but we're still really good detectors of when something is genuine, when something is coming from a person and helping us feel like we learn more about them or a certain circumstance. And it's going to be a skill that's never going to go away. You know, AI may be great at generating content marketing and copy, but it is not going to be able to replace you telling a story about a challenge you faced or something that you learned. We're just always going to have this neurochemical response there.
Yeah, the neurochemical response, I couldn't agree more. There's something magical about that human to human connection and the storytelling that goes in that. And I wanted to just bring up three words, which I know are very special to you, which is inform, influence, and inspire, because you've wrote the book on this. So these aren't just thoughts. This is The Perfect Story, which is Karen's book to people who are watching or listening to this episode. And Karen, really, the book is about, isn't it? How to tell those stories, how to inform, how to influence, and also how to inspire. So it's with HarperCollins. I mean, this is a great publication. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah. So I did a TED Talk in 2020, and the last line of, and it was on storytelling. It's what's happening in your brain when you're telling stories and why it's really important for leaders, especially. And the last line of that talk is, don't wait for the perfect story. Take your stories and make them perfect. What I've experienced in Fortune 500 and in all of my work is that people will shy away from telling a story because they think they're not a good storyteller, or they just don't know the perfect story to tell. They'll see someone on stage tell a story effortlessly and think, they skipped me in line when they were handing out the jeans for that because I didn't get one. And the joke is on them, because there's no such thing as the perfect story. There's not one sitting perfectly ready for you to pick up and deliver. you make your stories perfect by taking it through steps and making it be meaningful for each audience that you tell it to. And that was my goal for the book, to first introduce some of this new science and help people recognize that what you put into your stories is going to make a difference in how the brain responds. And I wanted people to feel empowered in making these choices that engage the brain, but in a really relatable way. This is not science class with lab coats and beakers. It is helping you understand certain concepts, making choices in your stories, and working through the steps you can always find and tell the perfect story for any audience.
So can we unpack that just a little bit, Karen? Because you've kind of give us the framework there, but what you're really sort of drilling down into there is taking what is a good story and ultimately it becoming this great story. So there was a book many, many moons ago called Good to Great. And I think there was a few follow-ups to it. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But when you're working with organizations or individuals and you're helping them down this road of turning a good story or maybe a story that they're trying to make good, how do you move from a transition from that to a great story that does resonate, that does influence? Is there some sort of steps that people need to think about? How do you go about working on that with somebody?
Yeah, there are so many steps to consider, or options, I should say, that you can consider. The first one is always the same, though. Even if you already know the story you want to tell, or you have no idea what story you're going to tell, you're always going to start first with, who is my audience? Who am I talking to? What do I want them to feel internally as a result of the story? Because stories do create that shift and connection. But what do I want them to know or do after? What's their mindset today and what might be an obstacle? So, in 5 minutes before a meeting, before an interaction, whether you're communicating or telling a story, taking time to really ground and think of one sentence for each of these, of what do I want my audience to know, think, feel, do? What's their mindset today? What might be an obstacle? That just helps you automatically narrow your message and also be clear on what you want that outcome to be. When you have that, you can then start to go through your ideas, your experiences, and ask yourself, which one of these can I use to make this idea? Can I help create what I want this audience to know, think, feel, or do? So it doesn't matter whether you know what that story is or you have absolutely no idea. Starting with the audience helps you really make sure what you're gonna do is be meaningful. Even if it's a story you've told multiple times, you still want to do it. And I equate it to when you're on an airplane and the person next to you says, "What do you do for a living?" We make this like subconscious split-second decision of, what am I going to say? Am I going to tell the version that I tell my relative that knows absolutely nothing about what I do? Or am I going to tell the detailed version that I might tell someone at a networking event who works in the same field, right? We make these choices because we want to figure out how to navigate the conversation. You're going to do the same thing with stories.
Makes a lot of sense. And just when you paint that picture of sitting next to somebody on an airplane or sitting next to somebody in the terminal, and they say, "What do you do?" There's different ways that story can be told, right? And I think that's a
Completely.
great way of explaining it. So thank you for that, Karen. Now
Yeah.
I know your work also takes you uh, both doing keynote speeches.
Mhm.
It also sees you dealing with teams within companies and running maybe workshops. And you also work with some executive leadership as well, don't you, in terms of crafting that storytelling? Could you maybe just touch on those little strands as well? Because I'd imagine I mean, it's all storytelling, but very different approaches to it.
Yeah, when it's workshops, it's generally where there's a team or maybe a level in an organization where they want to become more dynamic, memorable communicators. And so we go through step by step. How do you build your list of ideas for stories, get clear on your audience, put a structure in place, make the choices in how you engage the brain. We even get into how you can use your body when you're delivering stories to impact that. And the goal there is not just awareness, but behavior change. Keynotes are generally awareness with a little bit of skill. I always want people to come away being able to apply stuff. So we touch on things like, how do you get clear on your audience? Where can you find ideas? How might you structure a talk? But keynotes are also meant to be inspiring and build awareness and have a whole bunch of different stories in there, with the goal being this is a skill that you can learn and you can become great at. And the advising with senior leaders is often where they have a TED talk, they have have a annual offsite meeting, they're pitching investors, there's a thing that they're working towards, and they want to really become clear on the story they're telling for that audience. And then we usually expand it to how do you take that story and tell it to different audiences. And so it's very specific, getting down to almost word choices and gestures and things that can just change the meaning for them.
And when it comes, thank you for sharing that, Karen. When I was going to ask you, when it comes to then keeping your finger on the pulse, making sure that you're at the cutting edge of, the storytelling and how you then impart that knowledge and wisdom and advice and help. You're also a contributor. You write quite extensively, and I know some of the titles that our audience will know, Fast Company and Quartz and Ink and New York Post. I mean, the very entrepreneur, very sort of well-known titles. But as well as sharing that knowledge, how do you then make sure that you're up to speed, that you're focused on, the very latest information when it comes to storytelling? Because the landscape, the business environment in particular, it's constantly changing, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's not any one thing, because part of what I continually do is look at the science. What are we learning about the brain? What are we learning about communications, decision making? How can I take these studies and translate them in an easy, meaningful way? So there's always a piece of me that's looking at that. There's a piece of me that is listening to people in companies and in life, and where are they struggling? Why is this hard? If you shared with me something you were struggling with, I can generally extrapolate that other people are too. And it shows me this is a place to come and help people with this. And so listening is a piece of it. I am a sucker for pop culture, for comedians, for movies, for documentaries, for books. I pay attention to those things that just catch my interest for two reasons. One, there's usually something I can learn about how people have approached a story in it. But two, it becomes an example. It becomes something I might use in a story. So I collect phrases and things that I see that I just think are fascinating. And then the last is that I am an introvert that does my best thinking through writing. So that internal processing and putting it down on the page helps me kind of crystallize those ideas and often put together things that I write it and think like, well, who just wrote that? Where did that come from? And then I take that and I think how to translate that verbally. And so it's a combination of all of those things of there's always some input gathering and there's always some processing to try to see what's meaningful for people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Karen. And look, I know that you haven't just won one award or two awards, but four awards for the American Training and Development. And I really want to maybe go into the fact that when it comes to storytelling in particular, you mentioned a TED talk earlier, but and the sort of pop culture things that you were mentioning a moment ago. There's so many avenues now, or there seems to be so many channels to tell a story on now, where it's social media, where it's a written article in one of the publications we were mentioning,
Yeah.
whether it's a LinkedIn post or an article, for example,
Yeah.
or whether it's just a corporate presentation. Um, so when it comes to all those different sort of mechanisms, do you see a commonality in mistakes that people commonly make? Is there sort of
Mhm.
something where you can say, look, if I'm talking to 10 companies, I bet you seven or eight of them are all doing this, this, and this is what I have to sort of reinvent or explain how they need to approach it differently. Is there common mistakes that you see often?
Well, there are pretty common mistakes. There's three big ones that I see. First is that people love to tell the story they want to tell and not the one the audience wants to hear, which we can talk about. Second is they don't put any structure on their story and it's very hard to follow. And the third is they don't leave themselves enough time to work on a story. And so it starts to fall apart and they abandon it. So if we go to the first one, they're telling the story they want to tell. This is just like that uncle at the holiday table that is telling the same story year after year, where like everyone at the table could almost recite it word for word because they've heard it. And you don't even need to be there. He's not saying it for you, he's saying it for him. Just because you're on social media telling a story doesn't mean that you're going to get the success you want. Your goal is always, who am I talking to and why am I sharing this? What do I want them to experience? And so the more you dial in on that, the more you find your audiences and you say something meaningful. The second, the structure. When a structure isn't present, we notice, we've all sat through this. It's a little bit like those people that start to tell a story like this. It was Tuesday and I went to meet my friend and I was running late and wait, was it Monday? I think it was Monday. It must have been Monday because it was raining and I had on my yellow dress and no, wait, I think it was Tuesday. And you're in the audience and you just want to shake them and say, get to the story. You are killing me. This is so painful. What's happening is really well intended. The person is trying to place themselves back in that moment so that they can recount it accurately, right? They want to convey what that was for them. However, the people listening really don't need all of those details. You do need some, but there's a lot of extraneous stuff that we put in that just makes it very hard for the audience to follow. So a basic story structure is an organizing principle. Think of it like you're going to cook a meal. You want to gather all your ingredients to make sure you have them and not get halfway through and realize you're out of 3 things you need. So a good story structure is going to help you think through a basic structure, but also make it easier for the audience to hear. And the last one, the timing. Unfortunately, in business, we will spend hours building slides and lining up bullets and like designing beautiful things and maybe 5 minutes thinking about what we want to say. You have to flip that. Anytime that you're going to be presenting, whether you're telling a story or not, it shouldn't be what slides do I have or what do I have to say? It should be what does the audience need to hear? And how do I take them there? And if you start there and you start thinking about what you want to say, that flips that time and puts more into the way you're putting that together, how you're structuring it, how you're making sure it's meaningful for the audience, and that leads to a better outcome. When you start, content first and slide first, and you only leave yourself 5 minutes, it's never going to get you the outcome you want.
I really like that, Karen. Thank you for going through those 3 points. And a lot of those ring true. I think we've all had or have an uncle like that. And I think also those sort of 3 common mistakes or improvement areas that are quite common across the various landscapes. Yeah, very insightful. Thank you so much indeed for sharing that. And the last thing I wanted to ask you on this, because I do want to move on to a couple of other questions, is about culture as well. And I particularly like the first one where you said, look, don't just tell the story that you want to tell. It's about what do they need. And I get that. But have you noticed that different cultures expect a different style or approach to storytelling? Does it change when you're talking to different communities, different countries, different languages? What's your experience in that area?
What I would say is there are definitely cultural norms in what people are comfortable doing, which is not always the same thing as how the story is received. So there are certain cultures that it feels very, very uncomfortable to share a personal story. And that is understandable. That can be anywhere. I love to tell people personal doesn't mean private. A personal story doesn't mean you're sharing really private details that you wouldn't tell your average person, but every story is going to be personal, even if you're telling someone else's story, because you are bringing your perspective and there's a reason why you are telling it. And so if we follow that as a definition and a guide, most people would start with, I don't want to tell a personal story. But then if you said, well, what if we talk about this project and what you learned, or a lesson that helped you grow in your career, or something that you would want others to consider, would you be willing to share a personal story there? And they always say yes. And people respond to that. And so it's these preconceived notions of what stories are or what they think they need to be, and having to just work through and help people get to, you can tell something that's personal, that's in service of what you want your audience to do, that doesn't feel exposing or vulnerable and is really important and is going to get the impact that you want. So the differences I find are that we start in different places, but then when you work with people and they start to see the impact that some of these things can have, the story approach works the same. How we get to what people want to share and are comfortable with is different.
Yeah, no, that's great, Karen. Thank you. So look, I'm sure you're busy because storytelling and working in all the different avenues and doing all the speaking and the book and everything that you've got going on. What what do you go about when you look at planning? What are you focused on? What's on your horizon? What's the next 6, 12 months look like? How does that work in Karen's world?
So I published the book this past October, and I'm on I like to call it the world tour, where I am working to get the book in as many hands as possible. And so the next several months are talking in different universities, doing guest lectures, doing keynotes, working with different organizations, and being an evangelist for storytelling so that I can help people recognize this is a skill they can learn. And so I am excited for many different global events and look to continue to add to them over the next several months.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense. The other thing I wanted to ask you is that if somebody is trying to improve their storytelling, other than hiring Karen immediately, obviously, um, what would be sort of the first thing you would say to them? Like, what would be sort of that initial bit of advice that you would impart to somebody that knows their storytelling isn't great? They're trying to improve it. They're struggling. Maybe some of the stuff that they've put out there just isn't landing. It's not resonating. Where would you go about saying, look, this is where we need to start?
Probably two things. I think that first is start to notice what attracts your interest. What are those podcasts, articles, movies, conversations, things that just you find fascinating that you would sit down with a friend and say, oh, I want to tell you about this thing I just experienced. Start making a list. These are going to be potential ideas you weave into stories. Stories are this exchange of information, and it has to be something you have interest in. Otherwise, that dreaded flat energy comes across. So start that list and keep building it anytime you notice those things. The more excitement you have, the more energy that's going to come through in the stories. The second big thing is that there's this hesitancy when we're getting started to tell stories to think, when do I do it? Like, when is it appropriate in business to tell a story? No one is going to invite you to tell a story. No one is going to say, we want to hear a story from you. You are going to have to find these moments and try. And the more stories you tell, the better you're going to get at them. It's a compounding skill. So start to look for opportunities where you can tell a story. I have not met anyone that has overtold stories. They are usually not telling enough stories. And so start capturing those things that are interesting, start looking for opportunities to weave in stories. And when you're doing them, start first with your audience. And those three things will help you notice what's resonating, notice where there's an opportunity to tweak things, and start telling more of them.
And that certainly makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Look, finally, is there anything else that you want to share with our international audience here today? And secondly, and as I always say, importantly, if people want to connect with you, Karen, or they want to reach out and find out all the great things that you're doing, where's the best place to point people towards?
Yeah. So the first one, the overall message, not shocking, is about storytelling. Um, The thing to remember is this isn't just a fun skill or a communication skill. When you're telling stories, you're building an understanding in someone's mind, whether that's in a job interview, whether that's in a sales pitch, whether that's in a meeting. And it's a more dynamic way to honor people's attention, which is the greatest gift people can give us. So it's a skill that is worth learning and has just unlimited benefits. So my wish is that people will understand this as a really core communication tool that they can learn. Some ways to get started, you can look at my website and certainly the book, The Perfect Story. It is all under my name, KareneBer.com. You can find information on both, as well as a blog that has different storytelling tips.
That brings us nicely to the end of our discussion here today on the global discussion. Thanks to everybody who's been watching or listening to us around the world. And I hope that you'll like, follow, subscribe, do everything I need you to do to help support the show. Go and check out KarenEber.com and all the things that are going on there. And of course, the book, The Perfect Storm, certainly recommended for you to go and check out. And maybe you'll join me back here for some more discussions with creatives and leaders and thinkers just like Karen. Thank you, Karen. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you again today.
Thank you.